Welcome to Conversations With, a podcast series exploring the people and practices shaping the impact of private philanthropy to benefit communities across Africa. Conversations With is produced by the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group, working to promote robust, effective, and responsive philanthropy and to build a network of informed, engaged, and connected funders. Visit the africagrantmakers.org website for program notes and to join our mailing list.
So welcome, everyone. My name is Niamani Mutima, and welcome to the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group Conversation With series. So today we're talking with Ese Emerhi about her recent blog post, What's the Matter with Small Grants? Ese was recently the project director for the Kiisi Trust Fund in Nigeria. Welcome, Ese. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, good afternoon or good morning, Niamani.
So, Ese, before I ask you about some of the specific points you made in your article, I wanted to ask you what prompted you to write it.
I recently sort of wrote off leading the Kiisi Trust Fund at the end of last year in December 2020, and has a way of a reflective piece about my work with the fund. I thought about writing a piece around small grants, which was the strategic tool that the Kiisi Trust use as a way to work with, engage, and empower the local communities in Ogoni land. And I saw Owen has used this tool, the small grants method, and participatory grant making, that there were some hiccups or some challenges in utilizing and administering small grants. And I used the article as a way to sort of sort through my thinkings around that, and as a way to provide some recommendations or at least some nuggets for those in the sector to think about when using small grants as a strategic means or tool for engaging with local communities.
So I think it's really great, having come from that experience, to take a moment and reflect and to share those reflections. So I think this is a topic that is of great interest to funders among the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group and funders in general. So we're talking about small grants, which can vary in size from funder to funder. When people registered, we asked them what they considered a small grant. And for some, a small grant is less than $50,000. And for others, it was less than $25,000. And for others, it can range from less than $10,000 to even less than $5,000. So in your article, you do mention that the Kiisi Trust gave grants less than $10,000. But what did you have in mind when you were talking about small grants?
For me, small grants are really anything that is less than $10,000. And the reason I say that, yes, the Kiisi Trust used that ceiling when they were talking about small grants, but small grants, in the way that they operate, in the traditional way that small grants operate, these are project funds, short-term funds, usually 6 months, maybe as long as 18 months, maybe 1 year. But these are grants that are meant to sustain a local organization. These are grants that go towards strategic and operational activities of an organization. They are small, and specifically small because they are not meant to be sort of the long-term capacity building aspect that we usually think of when we think of grants. They are quick fixes in some instances. And so for me, the ceiling really, when I think of small grants, these are minute grants. One has small has $200, $500. And because of the way that because of the title, small grants, they are not sustainable grants. And so that's how I differentiate it from other levels of buckets of grants.
So in your article, you talk about 2 points. You talk about the limitation of small grant, and you also talk about the cost to administer them. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the cost to administer them, both in terms of time and money. So in your article, you wrote, quote, donors who engage solely in giving out small grants with the lofty belief that they are directly funding local initiatives often take on more than they bargained for in the process. So what do you mean by taking on more than they bargained for in the process?
Yeah, that's, for organizations like the Kiisi Trust and the work that I've done with other smaller organizations who do grant making, giving out small grants or giving out a grant, whether it's 5,000 or 10,000 or 25,000, for small grants, it can often take longer to administer, usually 3 times longer. A $5,000 grant can take as long as 3 months to go through the entire process of due diligence, to go through a local advisory body who often are the point people or contacts with local organizations in the communities. They are stakeholders, they are members of the communities they come from. And then there's also the staff time involved from that donor or that grant maker in overseeing that grant. And these sort of costs sometimes glossed over or not taken into consideration when the decision is made to give out small grants. It's a lot of work. One of the other challenges or aspects of administering small grants is the capacity building that will be required from the donor side to that local organization to ensure that they are able to actually access the funds, they are able to implement the project or initiative or activity that the grant is geared towards. And that capacity building aspect can be both informal and an informal sort of setting, lots of meetings to ensure that their capacity is comparable or up to par to the job at stake. And so that's what I meant by, often taking on more than you initially anticipate or expect in administering small grants. It's just as costly as administering a $100,000 grant or even $1 million grant. The work doesn't shift or doesn't become smaller just because you are giving a small grant of $5,000 or $7,000.
But I want to talk a little bit about the limitations of small grants. So funding the entrepreneur has become a strategy for many funders. And most of them, not all of them, but many of them are making relatively small grants to local organizations who are being led by entrepreneurial individuals. So you write that, quote, "There's nothing wrong with small grants if the direct objective is solving an immediate need. However, small grants cannot on their own address root causes of entrenched problems." So do you think that funders make small grants that they're intending to address an immediate need, or do you think that they feel that small grants have a more long-reaching impact?
The short answer is yes, of course. One thing that COVID has taught us, or COVID-19 has taught us, is that there are many, many small needs and immediate needs that communities are addressing either directly themselves or seeking external help to solve. So the short answer is yes. I think funders, when given small grants, are thinking short term, are thinking a quick fix, and are thinking of an immediate need. And, by the very definition, like I mentioned earlier, with small grants, the objective is not long-term planning. It's not sustainability or durable, sustainable development for organizations. And I should say this, there are many reasons why funders give, and small grants is just one tool or one strategy that many utilize in that given strategy or in that given aspect of the work. So, small grants cannot on their own, and I think that's what I was trying to address in the article. Small grants cannot be the only tool or solution that a donor or funder utilizes when engaging with local communities, when trying to solve problems together. Instead, they should sort of, use that as one approach. There are other approaches, sort of co-investor, co-creating solutions together, all of those things that empower and leverage community assets, community knowledge, and really dispels that power dynamic that happens between the funder and the grantee partner or the grantee receiving those funds. Small grants on their own can't address that whole gamut of needs and challenges, issues and problems.
Let's talk a little bit about your experience and your reflections from the Kiisi Trust. The Kiisi Trust Fund focused support specifically to benefit the Ogoni community. So it's safe to say that it was serving the local organizations that were anchored in the community. And I assume that many were working at the grassroots level. So can you share some of your insights about the impact of small grants in this context of the work of the Kiisi Trust Fund?
Maybe I can preface that by just giving a little bit of historical context with the environment in which we worked in. So Ogoni land is based in Rivers State, which is one of the states in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. This is a region that is actively involved in conflict. It's not post-conflict. So, almost every day, every month, there is a communal clash that is anchored or instigated by local courtists or court groups that are sometimes sponsored by community members, politicians, government. And so this cycle of continual conflict in the communities means that any development initiative, any funder that is willing to work in this community has to see conflict mitigation, peace building has a fundamental framework for engaging with local communities. And one of the reasons why the Kiisi Trust Fund decided to use small grants as a way to engage was initially we thought that this would be an opportunity to level the playing field in many ways, to bring on board many organizations that had been kept out of the cycle of funding from larger multinational donors, USAIDs, DFIDs of the world. And we wanted to be able to bring these organizations to the table with very small grants. Our average grant in the 3 years that I worked there was about $7,000, between $7,000 and $8,000. The ceiling was $10K, and just a handful of them received $10,000 to do work. And it was a method to at least to provide accessibility, to provide capacity, and to sort of hear what their needs were. Now, the reason I talked about conflict, and this is an environment that is actively tracing conflict, is that even this small grant strategy or model ended up backfiring with the Kiisi Trust. We very quickly realized that for some organizations, they saw it as a tool to divide. They wanted to use it for their own agendas, personal, professional, political agendas, and sometimes even social agendas. And because we were working with local organizations, CBOs, many who are receiving a fund for the very first time, this power dynamic reared its sort of ugly head in terms of petitions against the trust, petitions against the administrators behind the Kiisi Trust. And we had to find a different way of engaging with the local communities that really empowers them and does not cause even more division, more harm in the way we're trying to work. So I think, in one small way, the impact was really understanding the needs of the community, our community members, community stakeholders. In 3 years, we gave close to 40 grants to the tune of about $350,000. And these were scattered in 7 thematic areas that the fund gives grants in, from women's program to peace building, to civic engagement and accountability, governance issues, agricultural or environmental rights and injustice. And so in that sense, the impact was huge and was felt by many across the 300 communities that make up Ogoni land. But it was, as one of our board members said, we were just making small ripples with our small grants, and that the impact needed to be felt deeper. It needed to be truly entrenched in communities, and community members needed to feel like they were part of the solution that the Kiisi Trust was advocating for or speaking on behalf. And I think that's one of the reasons I know this year and going forward, the Trust is now interested in expanding that definition of small grants and really going towards institutional core support, identifying organizations that are directly embedded in the communities and empowering them to take on sort of the mission and goals and vision of the Trust forward.
So, Ese, you also talked about if small grants are an attempt toward addressing the uneven power balances in traditional aid, then its approach must also work to address, or at the very least, recognize limitations inherent in grant making. And you call for a tectonic change that disrupts and empowers local giving. So what do you think is the role of the foreign funder in that process?
A lot. I think pandemics like the COVID-19, urban disasters, health disasters like Ebola that happened a few years before that has really shown that if donors or foreign funders really want to achieve durable development, and by durable development, I mean things like ensuring that there are resilient systems in the ecosystem in place, that they are really supporting the capacity to build strong organizations with strong accountable leadership and governance. If we are supporting and if funders are really leading towards this thing called durable and sustainable development, then it means ultimately that they first of all need to consider and devolve power. And that could be the actions for devolving power. That there are many actions around that. It includes ensuring that you directly fund or strategically fund for long-term impact and involvement. And by long-term, these are typically 3 to 5 year grants, so that you ensure that the local organization that you're partnering with or co-creating a solution with is really going to be there beyond when the funder decides to leave that community or decides to change focus in that given. In addition to sort of this core support, there should be flexible funding that allows the organization to really decide for themselves how those funds would actually be used. It also involves things like ensuring that you value local assets, local knowledge, local activities and abilities to self-solve and self-organize for communities. Many times foreign funders would sort of parachute in and sort of dictate a preset goal and objective of what they want to take off for impact or for results, without any true engagement or involvement of the local partner. I think COVID has also shown that, foreign funders need to sort of start thinking what is next. And what is next is around supporting digital or technology tools. This could involve software as well as hardware. Many organizations, in their response to dealing with COVID-19, were sort of left out of the digital field or playing field that we now find ourselves in. Zoom meetings, digital tools to engage and network. Your typical local community-based organization did not have those tools, did not have the ability to engage digitally in that way. Yet they were in the front lines of addressing humanitarian need directly on the ground. I think another area for foreign funders to think about and be involved is in supporting more enabling environment for doing development differently. And you may have heard of, ensuring that development happens locally, ensuring that you really shift the power, ensuring that networks are empowered to really take the lead in addressing their own needs. Part of this also means supporting local efforts in enabling laws to promote giving and philanthropy or African philanthropy, as it is locally referred to, so that more people are incentivized and see the value of giving that can be gathered and counted appropriately. And I think, from Ebola to COVID to, we don't know what the next emergency would be, but this emergency response funders should think about creating emergency response tools to better deal with emergencies or pandemics that come forward. We know that the next one is coming. It's not an if, it is a when. And what COVID-19 has shown us is that none of us were adequately prepared for it. But that doesn't have to be the case for the next pandemic or the next emergency. We should now sort of take the lessons that we are learning currently and better prepare, build a better way forward going forward. And I think the last thing maybe I would say there in terms of how foreign funders can support is really supporting local organizations to deliver directly on their own strategic plans. These plans, some organizations spend a lot of time, years even developing and building, but not actually implementing specifically for the communities of beneficiaries that they say they're working for or working with. So I think supporting organizations to deliver on their strategic plans could be another way that foreign funders could be involved in or to help.
What do you think about the role of the local funder in that process? Do you think the issues that are at play for foreign funders are the same for those local funders? Like, did the Kiisi Trust ever encounter some of the same issues that you think foreign funders would encounter in funding local organizations?
I believe so. So there was I think this was probably around May, June of 2020, in the midst of lockdowns, restrictions on movement by the state and federal government. The Kiisi Trust was approached by a number of organizations to help around humanitarian aid, so providing food relief, providing sanitation materials, hand sanitizers, face masks, PPE, equipment for local clinics or rural hospitals. And, the same question came up from the board, which for me personally was a bit confusing because, sort of they were acting like the traditional foreign funders. They weren't sure of the credibility and the reputation of the organizations asking for this funding. They were cautious of jumping on a bandwagon where suddenly there were numerous organizations claiming to be a health-focused organization that did not exist the month before or did not exist the year before, but suddenly were parading themselves as organizations empowered to lead some of the health initiatives in the local communities. So that they were cautious about trusting and believing in some of the proposals that we received. And even when they did give, it was with very, against my recommendations, but it was with very strong strings attached to ensure that packs that were purchased, the face masks and hand sanitizers, there was evidence and proof that it went directly to the beneficiaries that the organization said that it would go to. And I think, one of those, what COVID, or at least in this environment, what it showed to the Kiisi Trust and to some of our other partners was that we saw a lot of organizations shifting or doing the mission shift to directly now address health needs, because that was the biggest category of aid that was available. Anything that was health focused, women's issues or women-led issues, those were things that were receiving the top funding and the top donors. So I think for local funders, sometimes they do face the same issues. And it also really goes to how they view themselves directly. Do they view themselves as actual funders in the communities? Do they view themselves as intermediaries for international funders? Do they view themselves as community foundations empowered to speak on behalf of the communities, empowered to take direction, to lead, to promote dialogue and solidarity? There was, or at least from my perception, there still seems to be some confusion in how they define themselves, especially community foundations. That language is still a relatively new sort of uniform or new apparel to put on and to own and define. And, even for the Kiisi Trust, though they describe themselves as a community foundation, it is still something that they are getting used to, and getting used to to the power dynamics that truly comes with calling yourself a community foundation that is responsible to not just beneficiaries, but to local, state, and federal government apparatus.
I'm hearing you advocating for co-creation of donor and grantee relationships as a way to break down the power imbalance between these two groups. What approaches have you found that help bridge that gap?
I think one approach that I've seen work really well is really not trying to have an answer at the beginning of a dialogue or at the beginning of a process, and really allowing the process to take as long as it needs to take. I think there sometimes could be a pressure, whether it's coming from the funder or sometimes coming from the problem itself, to have a solution really quickly and to solve it in the next 6 months or to solve it in the next month. But sometimes some problems would take some time, and to really be patient and allow the process to take as long as it needs to take, to really ensure you have all the different perspectives that need to be there, and not to sort of play that or come into the room with that funder or donor hat on, but really sort of saying that everyone is truly equal and will be treated equally. With the way we manage the Kiisi Trust Fund, it really was about ensuring that they didn't really hear directly from the trust fund or from me. Particularly, they would hear instead from community representatives, community stakeholders that we worked through. And if ever they had to directly speak with the donor, it was only if there was a problem with the grant implementation or contracting or the MOU signing. It was sort of those administrative issues where the donor's face is seen. But beyond that, it really was empowering and letting the community stakeholders take hold. So that process for us, we found, could be quite long. It can take several months. And I think that's one of the aspects I meant when I made that sort of comment or that line in the article, that, you take on a lot more than you might anticipate, and to let the process just play out.
One of the reasons why large funders support small grants programs stems from the narrative that large grants can be harmful to small community-based organizations. How would you advise larger funders to respond to this dilemma?
We face that directly. And I think, I'm remembering the words of the chairman of the board for the Kiisi Trust Fund in insisting that we keep a ceiling of 10 grants. And he gave examples of, if you are working with local community-based organizations, many of whom are receiving a fund for the first time, there's a high risk that the funds will be misappropriated. At least that was his strong belief. And the funds will just disappear, and there's no way to get those funds back or to have accountability around that process. But I think, the answer, the response to that is really identifying organizations that have been pillars or stellars within that community and really trusting them. And this is why, for me, I would advocate a longer term funding, 3 to 5 years, to really work with an organization to increase their capacity. Maybe the first year, the grant is small, however you define small grant. And in the preceding years, you increase the grant size because they have increased their capacity to absorb and manage that. Due diligence issues you can't avoid in grant making. You want to ensure that there are financial policies and structures in place. There's a board with proper board governance issues, that they are registered. All of these things are things you would want to ask for. But in the ask for these sort of documents, you also want to ensure that you're being as fair and flexible as possible. And so for me, sometimes even the grant proposal, I don't stick to a specific template. If the concept is good, we can work with you. You don't have to submit a 5-10 page document to receive a funding. As long as the concept is good, I can understand it. We know what the impact would be. We can work around documentation and reporting and those sort of things to just make it easier and available for as many organizations to access the fund.
What about giving organizations the chance to figure out how to manage a large grant? What's the appetite for risk? For example, if you have a small organization who's never had such a large grant before and is going to make some missteps along the way, but needs to build their capacity by learning how to manage that amount of money. And there's a school of thought that says that if you don't have the opportunity to do it, then how do you ever build a capacity to do so?
Yes, I think you have to be willing to allow mistakes to happen. You have to be willing to not be able, as a funder, sometimes to account for a certain percentage of the funds that you give. So of the $350,000 grants that we gave, there was a huge percentage that the board was willing to say, okay, we can't account for 20,000, we can't account for 50,000. And that's okay because of the way, because of the type of organizations we worked with. But in the process of even engaging with the Kiisi Trust, our hope was that they would have picked up one or two things in terms of transparency, accountability, governance structures. You have to be willing as a funder to fund more than what they ask. So if you want to ensure that they have the financial structures in place to receive $100,000 or whatever the magic number is for you, provide staffing for free or for the first 2-3 years. And that is at a cost to the donor. It is not part of the grants that you give to them. That is just additional support. And we did that quite a number of times to some of our grantee partners. We saw that the need, the ask to us was actually greater. And so while we would answer the ask, if they asked for 7,000, we gave 7,000, but we also gave additional support that was not counted as part of the grant to ensure and empower and give that capacity to the organizations. And so that, again, this is some of the things that, you take on sometimes more than you initially bargained for.
It's a good point that we have to use the periods between crises to invest in resilient systems. But these periods of relative calm tend to coincide with post-crisis funder fatigue. So how do we galvanize funders to step up right when they're stepping back?
I think a lot of that has to do with legitimacy of that funder within the community. If they are truly part of co-creating solutions, if they are truly part of co-designing programmatic initiatives and projects, then stepping back won't be part of something they would truly or ideally consider. If they're truly part of the community, and then they need to know that they are there for at least a decade, they are there for at least 5 years plus. And so stepping back in between crises or emergencies shouldn't be part of it. I think, for the Kiisi Trust, as a funder and also as a recipient of funds too, they see the community foundation as living into perpetuity in Ogoni land, that this is something that is here to stay. And in just narrating that, in just speaking that out, provides a lot of comfort to community stakeholders and to other donors too in the region, that if an organization or a funder like the Kiisi Trust is determined to stay here for the long term, is determined to be here into perpetuity, it gives confidence to other donors and other funders to also stay as well. But that comes with legitimacy and having the right to be there in the first place, and the support from stakeholders that believe in what it is that you can offer and give.
What about the appetite for risk? And I know the Kiisi Trust may be in a different category with this, but looking more broadly at funders, the appetite for risk, particularly among private funders. What's been your perspective on that, Ese?
appetite for risk. We had a very large appetite. And I think, and it came specifically because of our strategy of small grants. I was often referred to as the lady with the small money when I would walk into rooms or parts of the other donor communities because we were given small grants, we could take on a larger risk, as high as 20%, as high as 25%. This is not something that larger funders or funders who are given larger grants can take. And we recognize that. And I think, that was our method or way of rocking the boat. I think every funder, every organization would have to analyze and assess their own risk for grant making and what would be the cost to them. Is 5% a reasonable amount? Is 10% or 15% a reasonable amount of risk to take, where you may not be able to account for every penny from that grant, not from the administrating aspect, but from how grantees utilize that fund. Maybe you were looking for objective A, but instead of achieving objective A, you achieved something else, or just didn't get as far as you would have liked with that particular grant. And I think for me, it goes back to how you co-design what the initial concept for is and how what does success really mean. And I think this is one of the questions we kept asking ourselves on the board and even on the staff with Kiisi Trust and Trust Africa. What does success actually mean to us? What impact, what result, what indicator would be sufficient for us to say we were successful in this initiative, we were successful in this project. And sometimes that indicator or that mark is a soft, fuzzy thing. It's not something tangible. It's not something you can actually see and measure and count. But it could be in the way that community members now respond to you. It could be in the way of how you've empowered local communities to do things differently, or it could be in the way of shifting a mindset from one individual, from one thing to another thing. For us, that was success. If I'm able to see that people are thinking differently about development, maybe not doing development differently, but now the appetite to think differently and to use language like community-led, people-led, shifting the power. If they now speaking that language, then that's success. We'll get to implementing and doing differently at another time, but at least they are beginning to see the value of local knowledge, local assets, and that they can self-solve and self-organize for themselves. I think that is more of a powerful impact than we gave $50,000 or 50 grants to X organizations over a specific period of time.
How can the reporting requirements on small grants be less hectic than those for large grants without a dip in accountability?
I've seen examples of funders requiring grantees to do away with their interim and sometimes even final report and just putting something in the annual report of that organization, 1 or 2 lines, maybe a paragraph or 2 in an annual report that talks about what that donor did or what that project was. We've experimented with a number of ways with the Kiisi Trust. Initially, we were asking for 3 reports, sometimes for a project that is 1 year long. And, you end up just chasing reports after reports and not really looking at how that project is being implemented. In the end, we just now decided to just do 1 final report at the end of that project. And we even work directly with that partner, grantee partner, to not write the report, but just allow them to submit it in a format that they feel is suitable. So for some grantees, they will send the report in a video, in a 5-minute video about the impact of that project. For some, it could be several blog posts pulled together to make a full report. For others, it was an actual Word document with pictures and so forth and diagrams. We let the grantee decide for themselves the format in which they reported back their impact and the results of the grants. So that was one way of reducing that stringent due diligence aspect of it, but still assuring or at least letting accountability show.
So, Ese, what's been the hardest lesson that you've had to learn around the issue of building trust?
I think one of the things I definitely would take away from the Kiisi Trust is patience. I have definitely had to grow it or master it. I don't know if I've mastered it yet, but you have to have a lot of grace and a lot of patience, especially when dealing with communities that are angry, that have been lied to so many times from so many different stakeholders, from donors to government to politicians to even to individuals, brothers, their own family members. Entering that space requires a lot of grace, requires a lot of patience, and sometimes just even checking yourself what values and principles you hold dear and why you're even there. I think almost every month I would ask myself, why am I here? What is the point? What is the reason for being here? And I have this quote that I see every day in my office, and it goes, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. You have to know why you're there and remember that and act on it, actively act on it. And I think over time, community members came to see that this isn't a quick fix approach of the Kiisi Trust. This isn't something that after a while it would go away or people would change or that the intentions would suddenly become something different. Just the mere fact of us repeating that we are here for perpetuity, that this foundation is going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, that gave a lot of comfort to folks. And also just knowing that the funds are there. I didn't give the context or the history of the Kiisi Trust. The funds came from a lawsuit with Shell versus Weaver. These were the Ogoni individuals that were executed by the Abacha regime in the 60s. So, knowing that the funds were still there, they were safe, they were kept there. These are community assets in the millions, and that no one was stealing it. That also gave a lot of credibility to the Kiisi Trust and a lot of trust. So I think for me, it's grace and patience at the end of the day. Some of the lessons I'm taking away from it.
Grace and patience, yes. And I think the last year has certainly taught us all about grace and patience with the COVID pandemic. Small grants, large grants, all have their place. And as you point out in your article, regardless of the size, there's some very inherent power issues in grant making that need to be examined. Do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
For me, I'm still grappling with the question around what does resilient ecosystems look like? I think, for local organizations that have been used to being left behind pre-COVID to now being left in front with COVID because international funding has left and they are now left to actually handle and self-organize and raise the funds themselves. The question around what does resilience systems and environment actually look like. Communities, local organizations have been empowered because of COVID. The many negative things that's happened. One positive outcome from COVID-19 is that though international funders left, we could raise the money ourselves. We could organize ourselves. We could solve the problems ourselves. And you don't need external funding to do that. But now that we have been empowered and realize that we can do it ourselves, there's this whole system that needs to also now be in place. And what does that look like? How does accountability, now that it's local funds, does accountability mean something different? Is leadership now different? Or is it a matter of, which I don't advocate for, is it a matter of just copying what the West does and sort of copy paste into local context? That sometimes or in the past hasn't worked very well. But now that we've been empowered, the question of how do we continue to be empowered? How do we continue to ensure resiliency in the face of emergencies or even in the face of when there's peace, right? When there's no global enemy to fight, how do we continue to be good neighbors to our neighbors? How do we continue to ensure that we have safe societies for women and girls? How do we continue to ensure that healthcare is provided for those in rural communities? Those sort of things, those sort of questions and problems are always going to exist. And we need a different, maybe more powerful way of addressing it.
Well, Ese, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us and to share your experience with the Kiisi Trust Fund, which is in many ways a historic institution in terms of how it was established and what it's working to do, and to share your experience in making small grants.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity and the platform to share some nuggets or some insights from my work.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conversations With. We hope you enjoyed it. Please visit our website at africagrantmakers.org and join our mailing list. Until our next Conversations With, be well.